Chapter 10. Historical Perspective. The role I envision for the United States, leading cooperative efforts at improving the prevailing world order, is idealistic but not unrealistic. Indeed, it builds on a strong tradition of idealism in American foreign policy. The United States is exceptional among history's great powers in its commitment to the universal principles brilliantly expressed in the Declaration of Independence and reaffirmed in the Atlantic Charter, which was in turn reflected in the preamble of the UN Charter. Even Henry Kissinger, the apostle of geopolitical realism, acknowledges what he calls American exceptionalism. By this he means that the United States comes closer to basing its foreign policy on principles than do most other countries. In World War II, America fought for the survival of democracy and human rights, although the expression human rights was not as popular then as it has become since. America's war aims were avidly supported by many people in Europe, and the United States lived up to its image as the bastion of freedom and democracy. After the war, the United States continued in the same spirit. The alliance with the Soviet Union broke down because the Soviet Union failed to respect the principles of democracy and turned the countries allotted to it by the Yalta Agreement into satellites. Roosevelt's consent to a division of Europe at Yalta remains a dark spot in American history. The Marshall Plan was a bold and generous gesture. If the United States were capable of anything similar today, it would demonstrate the kind of responsible leadership that I am advocating. Arguably, the Marshall Plan was not as altruistic as it seems. Europe was in danger of falling under Soviet domination, and American industry was badly in need of foreign markets. But the role I am advocating for the United States is based not on altruism, but on enlightened self-interest. By that criterion, the Marshall Plan served its purpose well. Two kinds of idealism. The Cold War was fought over ideas as well as geopolitical interests, although once the battle was joined, the two became inseparable. Exactly what those ideas were is an open question that remains highly relevant today. I see the Cold War as a struggle between open and closed society, freedom and democracy, against totalitarian dictatorship. Others interpret it as a conflict between capitalism and communism. The disagreement is not trivial. Open society stands for universal principles, equally applicable to all. Capitalism is based on the pursuit of self-interest and is closely associated with geopolitical realism. The two concepts, open society and capitalism, are not too far apart. Open society recognizes property rights and cannot ignore geopolitical realities. Nevertheless, there is a significant difference in attitudes. Which comes first? Universal rights and the rule of law, or the pursuit of self-interest? The difference in attitudes was clearly visible in the divisions within the human rights movement during the Cold War. Freedom House was established in 1941 by people who later became known as neoconservatives and who used human rights as a weapon to fight the Soviet Union. Human Rights Watch, or Helsinki Watch as it was known in the beginning, was formed by liberals in response to the Helsinki Accords of 1975 and criticized the Soviet Union for its violations of human rights. In the eyes of the first group, we were right and they were wrong. The second group treated human rights as universal and was perfectly willing to criticize the United States as well as the Soviet Union. Indeed, many members of Human Rights Watch had been previously active in the civil rights movement in the United States. America's Watch was established as a companion to Helsinki Watch to monitor violations by both sides. The distinction became even more important after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. The capitalist interpretation led to the immediate introduction of a market economy with little thought for capacity building or nation building, as President Bush would call it. The open society interpretation would have required something akin to the Marshall Plan. In a similar way, the Declaration of Independence is also open to different interpretations. I regard it as a declaration of the principles of open society, with the proviso that they are not self-evident truths, but arrangements necessitated by our inherently imperfect understanding. By contrast, Leo Strauss, who supposedly influenced Paul Wolfowitz and other neocons, cottoned onto the first sentence of the Declaration and derived, from the idea of self-evident truths, the concept of natural rights. Clearly, that concept plays an important role in the ideology of American supremacists. Yet I was not even aware of natural rights until I started studying their view of the world. I discovered that the concept had often been used to impose obligations and limit individual choices. As such, it is associated with conservative arguments and papal pronouncements. For instance, it has been used to argue against abortion. Two such conceptual frameworks, one built on fallibility and the other on natural rights, are like two ships passing in the night. For example, Leo Strauss and Karl Popper have totally different interpretations of Plato's Republic, and although they were contemporaries, they made little or no reference to each other. It is therefore appropriate to distinguish between two kinds of idealism, one based on the concept of open society, the other on natural rights, in addition to the more traditional distinction between idealism and geopolitical realism. The additional distinction is particularly relevant at the present moment in history. The Cold War, ideas and interests aligned. During the Cold War, idealism and realism were easy to reconcile. Whether the ideal was open society or capitalism, the Soviet Union was the enemy. In this respect, the United States enjoyed the best of all possible worlds. It could be both superpower and leader of the free world. There were some differences between the liberals on the one hand and the neocons and geopolitical realists on the other, but they were united in their hostility to the Soviet Union. The most important disagreement related to the choice and treatment of allies. For the realists, the enemy of our enemy was our friend. Jeane Kirkpatrick, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations under President Reagan, drew a somewhat contrived division between authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. The real basis for her distinction was that the authoritarians were our friends and the totalitarians were our enemies. For instance, the United States was quite close to South Africa in spite of its unconscionable apartheid policy. Foreign aid was largely guided by geopolitical considerations and often served to sustain authoritarian regimes. The logic of this approach was similar to the formulation enunciated by Franklin D. Roosevelt with regard to Nicaraguan dictator Anastasio Somoza. He may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. Human Rights Watch was highly critical of this approach. Freedom House supported it. Bitter battles were fought on other foreign policy issues. There was very active congressional criticism of a Central Intelligence Agency coup against Salvador Allende in Chile, U.S. covert support for brutal military dictatorships in Brazil and Argentina, and eventually the Contra War in Nicaragua, all of which the proponents defended as justified by the need to fight the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere. Nevertheless, for the most part, U.S. foreign policy had the benefit of bipartisan support, with the exception of the Vietnam War, which deeply divided the country and left deep scars and bitter memories. Superpower versus leader of the free world. The Cold War ended with the internal collapse of the Soviet system and the implosion of the Soviet Empire. This was seen as a great victory for the United States, but the nature of the victory was never properly understood because the two roles, superpower and leader of the free world, were fused. Neither was it clear what the free world stood for, capitalism or open society. Was the collapse brought about by aggressive U.S. pursuit of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars scheme, the superiority of capitalism, or the yearning for freedom within the Soviet Empire? The response to the collapse was equally confused. The demise of the Soviet Empire in 1989 and then the Soviet Union in 1991 offered a historic opportunity to transform the region into open societies. The Soviet Union, and then Russia and the newly independent states, needed outside help because open society is a more sophisticated form of social organization than a closed society. In a closed society, there is only one concept of how society should be organized, namely the authorized version, which is imposed by force. Within open society, citizens are not only allowed but required to think for themselves, and There are institutional arrangements that allow people with differing interests, backgrounds, and opinions to coexist in peace. The Soviet system was probably the most comprehensive form of closed society in human history. It penetrated practically all aspects of existence, political and military, as well as economic and intellectual. At its most aggressive, the Soviet system even tried to invade natural science. The agronomist Trofim Lysenko tried to prove, with the help of Marxist ideology, that acquired traits can be inherited. Lysenko's most famous work centered on efforts to increase Soviet grain harvests. This result was to be achieved by exposing spring wheat to cold weather, thereby creating a strain of wheat able to withstand the Russian winter. Such experiments and their lasting detrimental effects on Soviet agriculture landed Lysenko, alongside Joseph Mengele, in the villains category of Time magazine's Survey of Scientific Achievement in the 20th Century. To make a transition from closed to open society required a revolutionary regime change that could not be accomplished without outside help. This insight prompted me to rush in and establish open society foundations in one country after another throughout the former Soviet Empire. I realized the importance of the moment. It is characteristic of revolutions that the range of possibilities becomes much wider. Changes normally beyond the realm of possibilities become attainable, and actions taken at that moment tend to set the course for the future. That is why I devoted all my energies to setting up my network of foundations, and why I pumped as much money into them as they could absorb. The open societies of the West lacked the same insight. They did not understand the historic significance of what was happening and carried on their business as usual. They were stuck in the groove of the Cold War, in which two worldviews and two superpowers were confronting each other, and they did not want to believe that the Soviet Union was changing its spots. The idea of intervening in the internal affairs of the Soviet Union in a constructive manner was alien to the prevailing mode of thinking. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to the United Nations in December 1988 and outlined his new thinking about a more cooperative world order, his speech was dismissed as a ruse. Gorbachev's new thinking originated in the Foreign Ministry. The other branches of bureaucracy were much less supportive. For instance, all the human rights initiatives came from the Foreign Ministry, not the Interior Ministry. That was a major source of his weakness. The U.S. government kept on asking for concessions, and when the Soviets granted them, it asked for more. I remember visiting Robert Zoellick, now U.S. Trade Representative, then in the State Department. He told me that there was no way the United States could provide any assistance to the Soviet Union as long as the Soviet Union continued to support Fidel Castro in Cuba. When the U.S. government could no longer deny that a profound regime change was taking place, it decided that it was too late to come to the rescue. When Russians begged for assistance, they were treated as beggars. The Russian economist Nikolai Shmelyov told me he spent 5 hours on a plane with then U.S. Secretary of State James Baker on the way to a ministerial meeting in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in September 1989, begging him for support to no avail. Gorbachev was left to his own devices. I have been far less hesitant to engage in such interventions on my own and received a remarkably positive response. A year after setting up a foundation in Moscow in 1987, I proposed an international task force to study the creation of an open sector in the Soviet economy. Somewhat to my surprise, I was much less well known then, my proposal was accepted by Soviet officials. The idea was to create a market sector within the command economy, selecting an industry like food processing, which would sell its products to consumers at market rather than command prices, with an appropriate system for transferring pricing from a command economy to a market economy. This open sector could then be gradually enlarged. It soon became evident that the idea was impractical because the command economy was already too diseased to nurture the embryo of a market economy. But even such a harebrained idea from an insignificant source was supported at the highest level. It is true that I was able to attract Western economists like Vasily Leontiev and Romano Prodi to participate from the Western side. Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov ordered the heads of the major Soviet institutions, Gosplan, Gosnab, and so on, to participate. Later on, I put together a group of Western experts who provided advice to different groups of Russian economists preparing competing economic reform programs. Then I arranged for the authors of the principal Russian proposal for economic reform, the so-called Chatalian Plan, led by Grigory Yavlinsky, to be invited to the 1990 IMF World Bank meeting in Washington. The plan envisioned splitting up the Soviet Union into its constituent republics, and at the same time bringing the newly independent states together in an economic union. Eventually, President Gorbachev decided against it, and the plan received a more positive endorsement in Washington with the promise of much-needed economic assistance. The disorderly disintegration of the Soviet Union could have been avoided. When the disintegration of the Soviet Union brought the Cold War to an end, the United States lost the enemy that had allowed it to be both a superpower and the leader of the free world at the same time. The change found us unprepared. We could not decide which of our two roles we liked better. We tried to be both, but the conditions that had made the two roles inseparable no longer prevailed. During the Cold War, the free world was threatened in its very existence and sought the protection of a superpower. Western democracies banded together in NATO, which was clearly under U.S. domination. But once the threat of Soviet Union invasion had been removed, the primary impulse for Western unity under American leadership disappeared. Other countries became far less motivated to submit to the will of a superpower. As a result, NATO has changed its character. It has become more like a multilateral organization. This became obvious in the Kosovo conflict, when every major combat decision had to go through a cumbersome approval mechanism, and the Pentagon was less than wholehearted in its support of the war effort. NATO has lost the appeal that it had held during the Cold War, and the Bush administration came to treat it as just another multinational institution. Recovering America's identity. To regain the identity it enjoyed during the Cold War, the United States ought to become the leader of a community of democracies and change its behavior accordingly. It ought to lead by building genuine partnerships and abiding by the rules that it seeks to impose on others. Since peaceful cooperative efforts do not necessarily succeed, the United States would still need to retain its military might. But this strength would serve to protect a just world order and would be seen as such by the rest of the world. This vision goes against the grain of the Bush administration's ideology, which I have described as a crude form of social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest as determined by competition, not cooperation. The Cold War fitted well into that paradigm. It was a competition between two superpowers and two worldviews, one based on free competition, and the other on the promise of social justice to be achieved by central planning. The 2000 foreign policy platform on which then-Governor Bush was elected president sought to recreate the happy days of the Cold War, but those days are over. Our identity has to be built on different premises. The failure of the central planning model did not prove the validity of the free enterprise model, although that is what those who saw the Cold War as a contest between capitalism and socialism believe. There is a better way of looking at the world. It is based on the postulate of radical fallibility, according to which all our constructs are flawed in one way or another. Specifically, both models, communism and free enterprise, or market fundamentalism as I have rechristened it, are deficient. The deficiency in each one can be cured only by taking some elements from the other. There can be no doubt that the communist model turned out to be inferior to the free enterprise one, but that is only because the free enterprise model has been pursued in a less dogmatic, extremist way than the communist one. Market economies are characterized by large doses of regulation and other forms of social intervention, not by the untrammeled pursuit of self-interest. In my opinion, it is more appropriate to attribute the victory of the West to the fact that it is an open society, whereas the Soviet Empire was a closed one. My way of looking at the world, however, is not widely accepted. Friedrich Hayek, the apostle of free enterprise, has been much more influential than Karl Popper, the philosopher of open society. Hayek's most famous work is The Road to Serfdom. Since the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom, market fundamentalism has become the dominant creed in the Western world. The mentality that had inspired the New Deal, the United Nations, and the Marshall Plan seems to have lost its ability to generate new ideas that could be turned into reality. Liberalism is not vanished. We are not a closed society. But it has become a political liability instead of a rallying cry. Even the political left, President Clinton in the United States and Tony Blair's New Labour in the United Kingdom, accepted some of the tenets of market fundamentalism. They were looking for a third way that avoids the excesses of both socialism and free enterprise capitalism. Unfortunately, the third way lacked the coherence and clarity of the other two viewpoints and never gained much traction. I believe the concepts of reflexivity, radical fallibility, and open society could serve as the basis of a coherent worldview that could give new life to old-fashioned liberalism. President Clinton came into office without any great appreciation of foreign policy issues. He had a domestic agenda, and he looked to his national security advisor, Anthony Lake, to keep international crises from taking up too much of his time and energy. The president failed to appreciate the historic significance of the ending of the Cold War, and he was more concerned with enhancing America's competitiveness than with changing the world order. His perspective evolved with the passage of time. He came to realize that an American president has much more power and influence on the international scene than in domestic affairs. He became personally involved in Northern Ireland and in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Acting as a conciliator suited his personality, and he made great strides in bringing both conflicts to a peaceful resolution. In Northern Ireland, the peace process continues, although it is not yet complete. In Israel, genuine peace and reconciliation were within reach when an Israeli extremist murdered Prime Minister Rabin in order to prevent it from happening. President Clinton persisted to the very end, but success never again came as close as it had been when Yitzhak Rabin was killed. Eventually, President Clinton did develop a coherent vision on foreign policy, but by then the historic opportunity presented by the collapse of the Soviet system had been lost. It is against this background that the Project for the New American Century was formed in 1997. It proposed a muscular foreign policy, including the invasion of Iraq, that stands in stark contrast to the one I am advocating here. Members of that project became influential in the present Bush administration and came to dominate it after September 11. They have prevailed to such an extent that the idea of America as the leader of a community of democracies sounds quite utopian. Yet it is they who are carrying an unrealistic and unattractive idea, military supremacy, to extremes. The idea of introducing democracy by military means is certainly more unrealistic than doing it through cooperative and constructive measures. Of course, my vision of responsible American leadership is not diametrically opposed to the policies adopted by the advocates of American supremacy. Both viewpoints agree that the United States cannot avoid intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. But I claim that we must do so only on legitimate grounds. The Bush Doctrine cannot be accepted by the rest of the world as legitimate. That is why I consider the policies of the Bush administration so harmful. They disbar America from becoming the champion of a community of democracies even before it has decided to assume that role. As I can testify on the basis of personal experience, fostering open societies is difficult even with the best of intentions. It becomes next to impossible when America is seen as pursuing its self-interest. We have lost the moral high ground for advocating a better world order and universal human rights. We can regain it only by rejecting President Bush when he stands for re-election in 2004, and by adopting a more benevolent role in the world. Collective security. The American public is currently preoccupied with issues of security, and rightly so. The terrorist threat is real, and the prospect of chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons falling into the hands of terrorists cannot be dismissed. The right frame in which to think about security is collective security. Neither nuclear proliferation nor international terrorism can be successfully addressed without international cooperation. It is incumbent on us as the dominant power to take the lead. Terrorism and weapons of mass destruction have become threats to our national security precisely because we occupy such a dominant position. The right way to respond is by strengthening our collective security arrangements. Our definition of collective security ought to be broad enough to include the kind of constructive, affirmative actions described earlier. The world is looking to us for that kind of leadership. We have provided it in the past, and one of the main reasons for such strong anti-American feelings in the world today is that we are not providing it at present. While collective security arrangements need to be strengthened, it would be going too far to replace national security by international security. Two considerations render this idea unrealistic. One is that the American public would never stand for it. There is a deep-seated aversion to relying on international treaties and organizations. Admittedly, the current negative attitude is excessive. It has been fostered by American supremacy advocates who have been very successful in influencing public opinion. A different leadership could influence public opinion in the opposite direction. Even so, it would be dangerous to go too far in subordinating our national security interests to international institutions because of the second consideration. International arrangements involve sovereign states. States are guided by their own interests. How can we then entrust our security to them? It follows from the postulate of radical fallibility that no international arrangement is foolproof. There is always a possibility that one of the participants will be successful in evading its provisions, and in that case, we must be able to rely on our own capacity to defend ourselves. The danger of cheating is enhanced by the fact that other participants are less democratic and less open than we are. Given that danger, we are also liable to cheat. Indeed, we have much greater chemical and biological weapons capabilities than any other state. It would be a mistake to juxtapose an uncritical multilateralism and the rampant unilateralism of the Bush administration. Not only would this approach lose in the beauty contest of the elections, but it would also fail to protect our national security. After the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and even more after the terrorist attack on September 11, the security threats that confront us have a very different character than before. We are not threatened by the conventional weapons of any state or a combination of states. We enjoy an unquestioned superiority as the sole surviving superpower, and we could maintain that superiority with much less expenditure than we currently devote to it. At present, we spend almost as much on defense as do all the other countries in the world combined. We are way ahead of them in technology. Naturally, they try to catch up with us the best they can, so we keep on pushing ahead on technology in order to maintain our superiority. This is an arms race between unequals that could be slowed down by international agreement. The agreement could be rigorously monitored, and the race could be resumed if there were any indications of cheating. We are in a position to dictate the terms that would satisfy us. We are prevented from doing so only by our own attitude. Nothing would satisfy us, because under the influence of extremists, we are opposed to the process.